The navigator's hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold at 35,000 feet. Captain Robert Fitzgerald sat at his small desk in the nose of the B-29, surrounded by charts, plotting instruments, and mathematical tables that represented the difference between 11 men returning home or vanishing forever into the Pacific Ocean. It was November 24th, 1944. Outside the plexiglass nose, there was nothing. No landmarks, no islands, no ships, just endless grey water stretching in every direction beneath a blanket of clouds that made celestial navigation impossible. They had been flying for 6 hours from Saipan, and Tokyo was still 300 miles ahead. Fitzgerald had made his calculations. He had plotted their course. He had factored in wind drift, airspeed versus ground speed, compass deviation, and fuel consumption. The mathematics said they would reach the target. The mathematics said they would have enough fuel to return. But mathematics had never seemed more abstract, more divorced from reality, than at this moment when nothing existed except ocean and the steady drone of 4 Wright cyclone engines pulling them deeper into uncertainty. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This was the problem that defined the B-29 campaign against Japan. The superfortress could fly farther than any bomber in human history, but distance meant nothing if you couldn't find your target. Navigation over land involved recognizable features, roads, rivers, cities, mountain ranges that appeared on maps and could be identified from altitude. Navigation over water, particularly over the featureless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, was something entirely different. It was mathematics made physical. It was trust in instruments and calculations when every human instinct screamed that you were lost. The question facing every navigator on every B-29 mission to Japan was simple and terrible. How do you guide a bomber 1,500 miles across open ocean, hit a target the size of a city with enough precision to matter, and bring the crew home when a single degree of error in your calculations could leave you circling empty ocean with fuel gauges dropping toward zero? The answer would come not from new technology or secret weapons, but from mathematics so precise, so carefully calculated, that it bordered on the impossible. And the men who would make it work were not pilots or bombardiers or gunners. They were navigators, specialists whose work happened mostly in silence, bent over charts and instruments, making calculations that determined whether everyone aboard lived or died. Their battlefield was paper covered in pencil marks. Their weapons were slide rules, octants, and drift meters. Their enemy was wind, weather, and the unforgiving mathematics of fuel consumption versus distance. Before the B-29 could bomb Japan, before American industry could bring its overwhelming production capacity to bear on the Japanese home islands, someone had to solve the navigation problem. Someone had to prove that a bomber could fly 1,500 miles over water, hit a target, and return. The standard navigation methods of World War II were about to be pushed beyond anything they were designed to handle. And the men doing the pushing were about to discover that getting to Tokyo was less about courage or firepower than about trusting mathematics when every visible reference point had disappeared below the horizon hours ago. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the most ambitious aircraft program in American history. Development began in 1939 when the Army Air Corps recognized that future wars might require bombing targets beyond the range of any existing aircraft. Boeing's design promised revolutionary capabilities. The aircraft would fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber yet built. It would carry 5 tons of bombs to targets 2,000 miles away. It would operate at altitudes where enemy fighters struggled to reach and where anti-aircraft fire lost effectiveness. The specifications were extraordinary. The B-29 measured 99 feet long, with a wingspan of 141 feet. 4 Wright R3350 duplex cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, drove the aircraft to a maximum speed of 357 miles per hour. Service ceiling reached 33,000 feet, well above the operating envelope of most Japanese interceptors. Combat range with a typical bomb load was 3,200 miles, enough to reach Tokyo from Saipan and return with reserves. But range on paper meant nothing without navigation capability to use it. The B-29's designers understood this. They equipped the aircraft with the best navigation instruments available. In the nose, the navigator's station included a drift meter for measuring wind effect on the aircraft's ground track, an octant for celestial navigation using stars and sun positions, and a small desk with storage for charts, plotting tools, and mathematical tables. The aircraft carried a radio compass that could home on radio beacons when they existed. It had multiple compasses, cross-checked against each other to account for magnetic deviation. These were standard navigation tools, refined and improved but fundamentally similar to equipment used on aircraft for 2 decades. They worked well over land where ground references appeared regularly. They worked adequately over water for shorter distances where radio navigation aids provided checkpoints. But the Pacific theater presented a unique challenge. The distances were vast. The ocean was featureless. Japanese-held islands provided no friendly radio beacons. Weather over the Pacific was unpredictable, with cloud cover often blocking celestial navigation for hours at a time. The mathematics of the problem were unforgiving. At 35,000 feet, a B-29 consumed approximately 940 gallons of fuel per hour across all 4 engines. The aircraft carried 7,390 gallons in its main tanks. A mission from Saipan to Tokyo required approximately 13 hours of flight time round trip, consuming roughly 12,200 gallons. But the B-29 carried only 7,390 gallons. The solution involved careful fuel management and accepting razor-thin margins. Crews would climb to altitude using maximum power, consuming fuel heavily but reaching the thin air where the engines ran most efficiently. At cruise altitude, they would lean the fuel mixture, adjust propeller pitch, and maintain airspeeds that balanced fuel economy against time over target. They would carry reduced bomb loads on longer missions, trading destructive power for fuel capacity, and they would trust that their navigators would find the most direct route to target and back, because every mile of unnecessary flying brought them closer to ditching in the ocean. Navigation errors had direct, measurable consequences in fuel consumption and survival probability. A 5-degree error in heading, maintained over 600 miles, would place the aircraft 52 miles off course. That represented approximately 15 additional minutes of flying time to correct back to target, consuming roughly 235 gallons of fuel the aircraft might not have remaining when the time came to return home. A 10-degree error doubled the problem, 15 degrees, and the crew might never see land again. Navigation in 1944 was part science, part craft, and part educated guesswork, refined through years of training and experience. The Army Air Forces trained navigators at multiple specialized schools across the United States. The curriculum lasted approximately 18 weeks and covered celestial navigation, dead reckoning, radio navigation, and meteorology. Students learned to use octants, drift meters, and radio direction finders. They studied mathematics, particularly spherical trigonometry for calculating positions from celestial observations. They practiced on training flights, initially over land where mistakes could be identified and corrected, later over water where the conditions approximated combat operations. The fundamental navigation methods were centuries old, adapted for aircraft but unchanged in principle. Dead reckoning involved calculating position based on known starting point, heading, speed, and elapsed time. If you knew where you started, what direction you flew, how fast you moved, and how long you traveled, you could calculate where you were. The method worked perfectly in theory. In practice, it accumulated errors. Compasses had deviation errors, Airspeed indicators measured movement through air, not over ground, meaning wind affected actual speed and direction. Small errors in any input created larger errors in the calculated position over time. Celestial navigation provided position fixes, independent of dead reckoning. A navigator would sight on a star, the sun, or the moon, using an octant, measuring the angle between the celestial body and the horizon. Combined with precise time from an aircraft chronometer and mathematical tables that showed where celestial bodies should appear at given times and locations, this measurement produced a line of position. The aircraft was somewhere along that line. A second sight on a different celestial body produced a second line. Where the lines crossed marked the aircraft's position. The process was elegant, proven over centuries of maritime navigation, and absolutely dependent on seeing both the horizon and celestial bodies clearly. Over the Pacific, problems multiplied. Cloud cover was frequent and extensive. Navigators might go hours without seeing stars or a clear horizon. During these periods, they relied entirely on dead reckoning, watching their position uncertainty grow with each passing minute. Wind was the greatest source of error. At altitude, winds reached speeds of 100 miles per hour or more. These winds were rarely steady. They shifted in speed and direction, sometimes dramatically. A navigator who calculated wind speed and direction at the start of a mission would find those calculations obsolete an hour later as weather systems moved and altitude changed. The drift meter helped measure wind effect. The device allowed the navigator to observe the aircraft's actual track over water by sighting on whitecaps or surface features. By comparing the observed track to the heading, he could calculate drift angle, the difference between where the nose pointed and where the aircraft actually moved. This measurement, combined with true airspeed and ground speed calculations, revealed wind speed and direction. But the drift meter only worked in daylight. Over water with visible surface features, and when not obscured by clouds. At night, in weather, or at extreme altitudes where surface details disappeared, it became useless. Radio navigation provided another tool, but one with severe limitations in the Pacific theater. Radio direction finders could home on broadcast stations or dedicated radio beacons, providing a bearing to the transmitter. Two or more bearings from different stations allowed triangulation to fix position. But Japan was not providing navigation beacons for American bombers. Friendly bases were thousands of miles apart. The radio navigation network that worked well over Europe, with its dense concentration of Allied airfields and navigation stations, did not exist over the Pacific Ocean. This was the reality facing B-29 navigators, assigned to the Marianas in late 1944. They had good equipment, excellent training, and proven navigation methods. They also had a mission that pushed every method to its absolute limits and beyond. 1,500 miles over water to a target they had never seen, through weather they could not predict, with fuel margins that allowed almost no error. The mathematics said it was possible. Experience suggested it was barely possible, and the first missions would prove whether possible meant survivable. November 24, 1944 marked the first B-29 strike against Tokyo since the Doolittle raid of 1942. 111 superfortresses from the 21st Bomber Command prepared for launch from Saipan. The target was the Musashino aircraft engine plant on the outskirts of Tokyo, a facility producing engines for Japanese fighters and bombers. The mission represented everything the B-29 program was designed to accomplish, and everything that could go wrong with long-range strategic bombing. Captain Thomas Sutherland, lead navigator for the 73rd Bombardment Wing, received his mission briefing at 0300 hours. The weather forecast was poor. Cloud cover over the target area was expected at 0.8 to 0.10, meaning celestial navigation would be impossible for much of the flight. Surface winds over the Pacific were forecast at 40 to 60 miles per hour from the northwest, but the forecast came from limited data. Weather reconnaissance aircraft had flown portions of the route, but vast stretches of ocean remained unmapped meteorologically. The flight plan called for launch at 0600 hours, formation assembly over Saipan, then a direct course to Tokyo covering approximately 1,500 statute miles. Estimated flight time was 6 hours 40 minutes to target. The return flight would benefit from tailwinds, reducing time to approximately 5 hours 20 minutes. Total mission duration, 14 hours, accounting for time over target and maneuvering. Total fuel consumption would approach the aircraft's maximum capacity with minimal reserves. Fatherland worked, through his pre-flight calculations, with the meticulousness that characterized successful navigators. He plotted the Great Circle route to Tokyo, the shortest distance between 2 points on a sphere. He calculated initial heading, factoring in magnetic variation and compass deviation. He estimated wind correction angles based on the forecast, knowing these estimates would require constant revision during flight. He prepared alternate routes to secondary targets if weather or enemy action prevented bombing Tokyo. He identified potential emergency landing sites, though options were limited. Iwo Jima remained in Japanese hands. The nearest friendly bases were back on Saipan or Tinian, the same bases they were launching from. The mathematics were straightforward but unforgiving. Distance to target, 1,500 miles. True airspeed at cruise altitude, 230 miles per hour. Time to target without wind, 6 hours 31 minutes. But wind was never absent. With forecast, headwinds of 50 miles per hour. Ground speed would drop to 180 miles per hour, increasing time to target to 8 hours 20 minutes. Fuel consumption at cruise power, 940 gallons per hour. 8 hours 20 minutes, consumed 7,830 gallons. The aircraft carried 7,390 gallons maximum. These numbers meant the forecast was wrong, or the flight plan was impossible. Fatherland knew both might be true. Weather forecasting over the Pacific was primitive, based on scattered observations and educated guesswork. The actual winds might be stronger or weaker, from different directions, varying with altitude and location. The flight plan assumed direct routing and optimal cruise conditions. Combat would disrupt both assumptions. Enemy fighters would force defensive maneuvers, burning extra fuel. Flak over the target would require evasive action. Formation flying consumed more fuel than individual aircraft. Cruise because aircraft constantly adjusted power to maintain position. The solution required navigation precision that seemed impossible given the tools available. Fatherland would need to find the most efficient route through constantly changing winds. He would need to calculate wind correction angles accurately, despite limited ability to measure actual winds over water. He would need to maintain situational awareness of the aircraft's position, despite hours of flight over featureless ocean with no visual references. And he would need to do all this while wearing an oxygen mask at high altitude, in temperatures well below zero, in an unpressurized aircraft where hypoxia degraded mental performance, if oxygen flow faltered even briefly. The B-29 seconds launched on schedule. Fatherland's aircraft, piloted by Major Robert Morgan, lifted off Saipan's runway at 06:15 hours. The formation assembled slowly, aircraft climbing in wide circles over the island, while others joined from their individual takeoffs. By 0700 hours, 111 aircraft were airborne and formed into 3 combat wings. They turned north toward Japan. For the first 3 hours, navigation proceeded according to plan. Fatherland maintained dead reckoning, updating his calculations every 15 minutes. He measured drift when cloud breaks allowed surface observation. The winds were stronger than forecast, 55 to 60 miles per hour from the northwest, but steady. He adjusted the heading, and the formation turned slightly west to compensate. Ground speed dropped to 175 miles per hour. Time to target increased. Fuel consumption increased proportionally. At 4 hours into the mission, approximately 600 miles from Saipan and 900 miles from Tokyo, the situation deteriorated. Weather moved in, heavy overcast from the surface to 40,000 feet. Visibility dropped to near zero. The ocean surface disappeared below solid clouds. Stars and sun vanished above. Sutherland lost all external references. Dead reckoning became the only navigation method available, and dead reckoning was accumulating errors with every passing minute. The wind had changed. Sutherland could feel it in the aircraft's behavior, subtle changes in ground speed that his instruments couldn't measure precisely without visual references. He estimated the new wind from changes in fuel consumption and elapsed time, backing into wind speed mathematically. The calculations suggested winds had increased to 70 miles per hour and shifted more westerly. If true, the formation was being pushed east, of course, away from the optimum route to Tokyo. Every mile east meant additional miles to fly later, correcting back toward the target. Sutherland made a decision that characterized the navigation challenge on these missions. He recommended a heading change to the west, compensating for what he calculated was the wind drift. Major Morgan trusted his navigator and turned the aircraft to the new heading. The rest of the formation followed. They were now flying on faith in mathematics, heading toward a target they couldn't see, through weather they couldn't penetrate, with position uncertainty growing by the mile. At 5 hours and 30 minutes, Sutherland calculated they should be approximately 300 miles from Tokyo. But calculated position and actual position might differ by 50 miles or more, given the accumulated navigation errors. In clear weather over land, 50 miles meant nothing. You could see cities and terrain features from that distance and correct your course. Over the Pacific in solid clouds, 50 miles was the difference between finding Tokyo and circling aimlessly while fuel drained away. Then something unexpected happened. At 5 hours, 45 minutes, approximately 240 miles from Tokyo by Sutherland's calculations, the formation broke out of the clouds. Below them appeared the coastline of Japan. Sutherland identified landmarks immediately. The distinctive shape of the Boso Peninsula jutted into the Pacific. Tokyo Bay stretched to the west. The city itself was visible in the distance, sprawling across the Kanto Plain. His position fix from the coastal landmarks revealed the navigation accuracy. They were 11 miles east of the calculated position and 3 miles south. After nearly 6 hours of flight over open ocean, 5 hours of it in solid instrument conditions with no visual references, the accumulated error was 14 miles. The mathematics had worked. The dead reckoning, constantly updated with wind estimates and heading corrections, had delivered the formation to within visual range of the target, despite conditions that seemed to make accurate navigation impossible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the revelation went deeper than simple arrival at the target. Sutherland's navigation had been based on a technique that most navigators still considered experimental and unreliable. He had used pressure pattern navigation, a method that incorporated weather forecasting and atmospheric pressure patterns into the navigation solution. Instead of treating wind as a random variable to be measured and compensated for, pressure pattern navigation treated wind as a predictable phenomenon that could be forecasted and incorporated into route planning. The method required understanding how weather systems moved and how air pressure differences created wind. High-pressure systems rotated clockwise in the northern hemisphere, creating winds that spiraled outward. Low-pressure systems rotated counterclockwise, creating winds that spiraled inward. The position and movement of these systems could be forecasted, at least roughly, from scattered weather observations. A navigator who understood the pressure patterns could predict wind speeds and directions along the flight route and plan accordingly. Sutherland had studied meteorology extensively beyond the basic training provided at navigation school. He understood that the Pacific in November featured a persistent high-pressure system near Hawaii and a low-pressure system that typically formed east of Japan. The interaction between these systems created strong westerly winds at altitude across the central Pacific. but the winds weren't uniform. They varied with latitude and longitude, stronger near the low pressure center, weaker toward the high. His route planning had accounted for this. Instead of flying the direct Great Circle route to Tokyo, he had adjusted the course slightly south, where winds were forecasted to be weaker. The adjustment added approximately 20 miles to the total distance, but saved nearly 45 minutes in flight time by reducing headwind effect. The fuel savings from reduced flight time exceeded the fuel cost of the Kostrogau, longer distance. The bombing run over Tokyo lasted 18 minutes. Flak was heavy but inaccurate at the B-29's altitude. Japanese fighters appeared but struggled to reach 32,000 feet where the formation operated. The Musashino plant disappeared under clouds before bombardiers could achieve good sight pictures. Most bombs fell on estimated positions rather than visual targets. Bombing results were poor, but the mission's primary achievement wasn't the damage inflicted. It was the proof that B-29 seconds could reach Tokyo from the Marianas and return. For Sutherland and every navigator in the formation, the return flight presented a different challenge. The winds that had fought them on the way to target now assisted. Ground speeds increased to 280 miles per hour as the jet stream pushed the bombers eastward. But wind assistance created its own navigation problems. With such high ground speeds, even small errors in heading resulted in large cross-track deviations in short time periods. Sutherland calculated a new course for return, again adjusting from the direct route to optimize wind usage. The formation turned southeast from Tokyo, aiming not directly at Saipan but at a point 100 miles east of Saipan. This allowed them to ride the strongest jet stream winds for the maximum distance. As they approached the Marianas, they would turn west, trading some of the tailwind benefit for accurate arrival at base. The weather remained poor for most of the return flight. Sutherland navigated by dead reckoning, updating his position estimate every 10 minutes based on calculated ground speed and elapsed time. He had no way to verify his position until they reached the Marianas. If his calculations were wrong, they might miss the islands entirely, continuing southeast into empty ocean until fuel exhaustion forced ditching. At 4 hours into the return flight, roughly 900 miles from Tokyo and 600 miles from Saipan, Sutherland prepared for the critical navigation challenge of the mission. Finding Saipan required more precision than finding Tokyo. Tokyo sprawled across hundreds of square miles, impossible to miss if you reached the general area. Saipan was a small island, 12 miles long and 5 miles wide, surrounded by hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Missing the island by 50 miles meant circling to search, burning fuel they didn't have. Sutherland's position estimate placed them on course, but position estimates meant nothing without verification. He needed a position fix, actual confirmation of location rather than calculated guess. Celestial navigation remained impossible due to clouds. Radio direction finding offered the only solution. Saipan's radio beacon transmitted continuously, a navigation signal that aircraft could home on from hundreds of miles away. The radio compass needle swung and steadied, pointing northwest. Sutherland calculated the bearing and plotted it on his chart. The bearing line passed within 3 miles of his calculated position. The mathematics continued to validate itself. His navigation had been accurate within a margin that seemed impossible given the conditions and distances involved. At 5 hours 15 minutes into the return flight, the clouds broke. Saipan appeared ahead, exactly where Sutherland's calculations predicted. The formation descended, aircraft peeling off to enter landing patterns at Isley Field. Morgan's B-29 touched down at 15:30 hours, 9 hours and 15 minutes after takeoff. Fuel remaining, 900 gallons, enough for approximately 1 additional hour of flight. Sutherland completed his navigation log, documenting the mission's track, winds encountered, and position fixes obtained. The log would be analyzed by intelligence officers and navigation specialists, looking for lessons that could improve future missions. But the most important lesson was already obvious to everyone who had flown the mission. The mathematics worked. Navigators could guide B-29 seconds, 1,500 miles over open ocean, hit targets, and return with workable accuracy, despite weather, despite limited navigation aids, despite conditions that would have made such missions impossible just years earlier. What made this possible wasn't new technology. The octants, drift meters, and radio compasses were refined versions of equipment that existed before the war. What made it possible was mathematical precision in applying these tools. Understanding weather patterns well enough to predict winds hours in advance, and trusting calculations when every human instinct demanded visual confirmation of position. The navigators who made it work were applying mathematics at a level that seemed impossible, and they were doing it routinely, mission after mission, knowing that errors meant death for everyone aboard. The success of the first Tokyo mission established the pattern for hundreds of missions that would follow over the next 9 months. Between November 1944 and August 1945, B-29 seconds from the Marianas flew more than 30,000 sorties against targets across Japan. Every sortie depended on navigation precision that pushed human capability to its limits. The navigators who made these missions possible worked under conditions that accumulated strain in ways that weren't immediately visible but were absolutely real. A typical mission lasted 14 to 16 hours. The navigator spent this entire time at his station, bent over charts and instruments in the cramped nose compartment. The temperature at 35,000 feet dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The aircraft was unpressurized and heated only marginally by ducted air from the engines. Navigators wore heavy flight suits, gloves, and boots, but cold penetrated everything on missions lasting half a day or more. Frostbite affected extremities. Fingers went numb, making the delicate work of plotting positions and manipulating instruments difficult. Oxygen deprivation was a constant threat. At altitude, crew members breathed through masks connected to the aircraft's oxygen system. The system was reliable under normal conditions, but combat was never normal. Flak damage could rupture oxygen lines. Equipment malfunctions could reduce flow. Even without system failures, pure oxygen breathed for hours caused physiological effects. It dried mucous membranes, causing nosebleeds. It created a subtle euphoria that masked the onset of hypoxia if flow decreased. Navigators had to remain mentally sharp while their bodies fought against the environment, calculating courses and plotting positions when even simple arithmetic became challenging. The psychological burden was perhaps greater than the physical. A navigator's calculations determined whether 11 men lived or died. Every heading he gave the pilot, every wind correction, every position estimate carried that weight. On missions where fuel margins were measured in minutes rather than hours, a single significant error could doom the crew. They would run out of fuel over the Pacific, ditch in the ocean if they were lucky enough to find relatively calm water, and hope rescue aircraft could locate them before exposure or sharks finished the job. Lieutenant James Patillo, navigator with the 509th Bombardment Group, described the experience in a letter home written in January 1945. He wrote that the worst part wasn't the fear of enemy action. Japanese fighters and flak were dangers you could see and react to. The worst part was the hours over water when nothing existed except ocean and clouds, when his calculations said they were on course but visual confirmation was impossible, when fuel gauges showed reserves dropping and every mile flown was a mile that couldn't be flown again. He wrote that he double-checked every calculation, then triple-checked them, knowing that confidence in his mathematics was all that separated the crew from disaster. The strain accumulated across multiple missions. Navigators flew 30 to 35 combat missions to complete a tour, though crew losses meant many never reached that number. Each mission reinforced the lesson that precision mattered absolutely. The missions that went well, where navigation was accurate and fuel reserves adequate, validated the mathematics and the training. The missions where navigation errors occurred, where aircraft arrived off course or dangerously low on fuel, provided brutal education in the consequences of mistakes. Some navigators broke under the pressure. Flight surgeons grounded men who showed signs of severe stress, inability to concentrate, or loss of confidence in their navigation skills. These groundings were necessary but created their own problems. Experienced navigators were scarce. Training a replacement took months. Crews trusted navigators they had flown with repeatedly. A new navigator, however, competent, hadn't yet earned that trust through shared experience over the Pacific. The navigation challenge evolved as the bombing campaign intensified. Early missions targeted precision industrial facilities, requiring accurate navigation to specific points. Later missions shifted to area bombing of cities, where navigation requirements were less stringent, but distances remained punishing. The firebombing campaign that began in March 1945 involved lower-altitude approaches, reducing the navigation advantages of high-altitude flight, but also reducing fuel consumption, allowing heavier bomb loads. The mission of March 9 to 10, 1945, exemplified the mature B-29 campaign. 334 aircraft struck Tokyo in a night attack from altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. The lower altitudes meant navigators couldn't use celestial navigation effectively, the horizon being obscured by darkness and weather. They relied primarily on radar navigation, using the aircraft's APQ-13 radar to identify coastal features and correlate them with charts. The technique worked, delivering the formation to target with sufficient accuracy to devastate 16 square miles of Tokyo with incendiary bombs. The navigation success of the B-29 campaign reflected advantages that went far beyond individual skill or courage. American navigators had tools and training that represented decades of investment in mathematics, education, meteorology, and precision instrument manufacturing. The octants they used were manufactured to tolerances, measured in seconds of arc. The chronometers kept time accurate to within seconds per day, essential for celestial navigation, where 4 seconds of time error translated to 1 mile of position error. The drift meters and radio compasses were engineered to function reliably at extreme altitudes and temperatures. Japan had navigators and navigation equipment, but the disparity in quality and availability was stark. Japanese training emphasized basic navigation skills, adequate for shorter-range missions over familiar territory. Long-range navigation over open ocean received less attention because Japan's aircraft couldn't fly such missions effectively. The Japanese Navy had developed some long-range capabilities for maritime patrol and reconnaissance, but the Army Air Force that bore primary responsibility for defending the home islands against B-29 attacks lacked equivalent training and equipment. The meteorological disparity was even more significant. American weather forecasting in the Pacific Theater drew on observations from dozens of weather reconnaissance aircraft, surface ships, submarines, and island stations. Meteorologists compiled this data daily, creating weather maps that showed pressure systems, fronts, and wind patterns across thousands of miles. These forecasts were imperfect, but they provided navigators with information that improved navigation accuracy, substantially compared to flying with no weather information. Japan had lost most of its weather reconnaissance capability by late 1944. American submarines and aircraft had sunk many of the vessels that gathered maritime weather data. Island stations in Japanese-held territory were isolated and often unable to transmit observations due to American signal intelligence that could locate transmitters and direct strikes against them. Japanese forecasters worked with fragmentary data, unable to create the comprehensive weather pictures that American forecasters produced routinely. The mathematical foundation was perhaps the most important disparity. American navigator training included extensive instruction in spherical trigonometry, the mathematics of navigation on a spherical Earth. Students learned to calculate great circle distances, convert between coordinate systems, and solve navigation problems using logarithmic tables and slide rules. The training assumed students had strong basic mathematics education from civilian schooling. Most American navigators had completed high school and often some college, giving them mathematical foundations that made advanced navigation training effective. The pressure pattern navigation techniques that navigators like Fatherland employed weren't officially taught at navigation school initially. They were advanced methods developed by individual navigators and meteorologists, shared informally, and gradually incorporated into training as their effectiveness became proven. This represented a flexibility in American military education, an ability to recognize and disseminate innovations that emerged from practical experience rather than only teaching officially approved doctrine. By spring of 1945, navigation techniques had evolved to the point that missions to Japan were routine rather than remarkable. The 20th Air Force, which controlled all B-29 operations, launched strikes of 300 or more aircraft regularly. Navigation accuracy improved as techniques matured. Aircraft losses due to navigation errors, always small compared to combat losses, dropped to near zero. The navigation problem that had seemed nearly impossible in November 1944 had become manageable through combination of training, experience, and mathematical precision. The Japanese response to the B-29 campaign revealed their understanding of the strategic implications. They couldn't prevent the attacks through fighter interception or anti-aircraft fire. American bombers operated at altitudes and with defensive armament that made interception costly for Japanese fighters. They couldn't destroy the Marianas bases through counterattack. American naval and air superiority around the Marianas was absolute by early 1945. The only option was dispersing industry and hoping that America would tire of the campaign before Japan's capacity to resist was completely destroyed. That hope proved false. American industry produced B-29 seconds, faster than Japan could shoot them down. American training pipelines produced replacement crews faster than Japan could attrit them. And American navigators continued guiding bombers to targets across Japan with precision that made strategic bombing a reality rather than a hopeful theory. The navigation achievement wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve heroic last stands or desperate battles. It involved mathematics, careful planning, and execution under conditions that tested human limits. But it made everything else possible. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the B-29 campaign was recognized as a decisive factor in the outcome. The firebombing of Japanese cities killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroyed much of Japan's remaining industrial capacity. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, delivered by B-29 seconds, provided the final demonstration that Japan could not defend itself against American air power. All of this depended on navigation, on the ability to guide bombers across vast ocean distances to specific targets and return them safely. The navigators who made it possible rarely received recognition comparable to pilots or bombardiers. Their work was technical, unglamorous, performed in relative obscurity at small desks in aircraft noses, while others handled the visible aspects of combat. But pilots knew the truth. Every pilot who flew missions to Japan understood that his navigator held the crew's survival in his hands. The trust between pilot and navigator was absolute because it had to be. When you flew 1,500 miles over open ocean, you trusted mathematics and the man who calculated them. After the war, many B-29 navigators returned to civilian life and brought their skills to commercial aviation, meteorology, and engineering. The navigation techniques developed during the war influenced post-war aviation. Pressure pattern navigation became standard for long-range commercial flights. The mathematical foundations of modern GPS navigation systems trace directly to the spherical trigonometry and great circle calculations that World War II navigators performed manually with slide rules and tables. The broader lesson from the B-29 navigation achievement concerned the nature of modern warfare. Wars between industrial nations were won not just through courage or tactical brilliance, but through superior systems, training, and technology. The Manhattan Project that produced atomic bombs required theoretical physics and industrial engineering at unprecedented levels. The naval campaign that isolated Japan required logistics, production capacity, and operational planning on global scale. The B-29 campaign required navigation precision that pushed human mathematical capability to its limits. Japan fought with courage and determination equal to any nation in history. Japanese pilots flew suicide missions against American ships. Japanese soldiers defended islands to the last man rather than surrender. Japanese civilians endured firebombing and atomic attack with resilience that awed even their enemies. But courage couldn't compensate for industrial and intellectual disparities. When American navigators could routinely guide bombers across 1,500 miles of ocean while Japanese navigators lacked equivalent capability, the outcome was predetermined. Captain Robert Fitzgerald, whose shaking hands at 35,000 feet began this story, completed his combat tour in April 1945. He flew 31 missions to Japan, guiding his crew across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean with navigation accuracy that kept them alive, when dozens of other crews died from navigation errors, combat damage, or simple mechanical failure. His post-war career included work as a commercial airline navigator, then as an instructor teaching navigation at civilian aviation schools. He rarely discussed the war in detail, but he kept his navigation logs, filled with pencil marks showing courses plotted, winds calculated, and positions fixed across missions that pushed navigation art to its absolute limits. In those logs, preserved in archives decades after the war, the story of the B-29 navigation achievement exists in its purest form. Numbers written in pencil by men who knew that every calculation mattered absolutely, headings given to pilots who trusted those calculations with their lives. Wind corrections made in clouds over open ocean when nothing existed except mathematics and faith that the mathematics would prove sufficient. The logs show no drama, no heroics, just careful professional work performed under conditions that tested human limits. That was the achievement. That was how one navigator's impossible mathematics let B-29 seconds hit Tokyo from 1,500 miles away. Not through miracles or secret weapons, but through training, precision, and trust in mathematics, when trust was the only thing, keeping 11 men alive over the Pacific Ocean. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.